Global Day of Climate Action has begun, including hundreds taking to the streets in Australia. Unions, workers, and other supporters of the Fridays for Future movement have joined students in a march across Sydney, demanding that no more coal, oil, and gas projects be approved. Protesters have also taken to the streets of Rome and Jakarta, and more strikes are expected in the U.S. as well. There's also a climate protest taking place here in Berlin, and DW's Julia Saudelli joins me from there. Julia, what are the main demands of the protesters?
Well, the focus here in Berlin today is looking at how to transform the transport sector. And that is why also Fridays for Future here today is protesting alongside the transport unions, as both of them say that there needs to be more investment in the transport industry if it wants to become climate neutral, if it wants to reduce its CO2 emissions. And both Fridays for Futures and the unions are saying that also goes alongside increasing the wages of transport workers. But also on the agenda today, a protest against plans from the transport minister here in Germany to increase and up the building of new highways meant for cars, and also his threat to veto the approval at EU level of the phase out of combustion engine vehicles by 2035. That is something that he said he might want to block in the upcoming vote.
Now, these strikes, Julia, are happening around the world today. What does the broader picture look like?
Yeah, we've seen protests happening everywhere from Australia to other cities here in Europe. And Friday for Futures has put the focus on fighting against the financing of fossil fuels like coal, like gas, like oil being the main causes of human-created climate change. And if we look at the broader context, in 2022, big oil companies reported their biggest profits ever in a context where energy prices were affected by the war in Ukraine. And as the protesters here say, the International Energy Agency itself says that there is a need to stop funding fossil fuel projects immediately if we want to reach the Paris Agreement goal of keeping the rise in global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is what protesters here are calling for today.
Julia, thank you very much. Our correspondent Julia Saudelli here in Berlin. Well, these protests come as fears grow about the long-term impact of severe winter droughts being experienced across Europe. Rainfall is sharply down in many countries, with wide-ranging consequences for agriculture, energy, and more. All this comes after the worst summer drought in 500 years in Europe. So, how bad has the winter been, and what does that mean for the coming months and years?
This is what winter drought looks like across France, Spain, and Italy. Lakes and rivers far below their normal level or dried up entirely. Farm fields dry and dusty. This used to be an island in Italy's Lake Garda. No longer.
I've lived here for 18 years and I've never seen the lake so dry. I used to come here by boat, but now I can walk. Let's hope for rain.
This year, France saw its longest winter period without rainfall on record, 32 days. The Alps have seen about half their usual snow. And Italy's River Po, that feeds much of the country's agriculture, is down 61% from normal. Just one example, Italy's rice harvest is threatened for the second year in a row. There are problems that prevent plowing. The soil is so hard that the plows can't cut through the earth. Farmers aren't the only ones worried. The lack of snow means less snow melt flowing into lakes and rivers in the coming months. That will translate into less hydropower from dams, as well as less cooling for nuclear reactors. France is developing an action plan to save water at the national level. The nation needs to do with water what we have done with energy, a kind of sobriety plan. We must all pay attention to this resource that is becoming rare. It's the end of abundance. But no matter how much people conserve, more rainfall is necessary. The spring months will be crucial, and meteorologists don't know how much rain will fall. If there's not enough, Europe may be set for yet another devastating dry season.
Well, for more on this, we have Ajit Naranjan from DW Environment here in the studio. Ajit, tell us how this drought is impacting people's lives.
So when you have these really dry conditions, particularly in winter where you'd normally expect there to be much more rain and wetness generally in Europe, it's a big warning sign for farmers particularly. It means that you're starting the year off with water levels running low. I mean, you've got riverbeds drying up. And that means that then when rain actually does fall, the ground is so hard that it can't really soak up the water. And so these problems really get entrenched from the very beginning of the year and continue throughout the year. But they also stretch well beyond just, food is one big aspect of it, but it goes everything from nuclear power plants that need water for cooling are going to struggle. Hydropower, electricity from dams is also going to be an issue. So you get these massive impacts that we're just starting to see the warning signs of at this stage in the year.
We heard the French president in that report we just watched calling for a reduction in water usage. What else can governments do to deal with this?
So we're at the early stage of government plans. I think Italy's agriculture minister proposed that they would get some aqueducts. Italy's famous, I guess, in Roman times for these big aqueducts. We're talking more about pipes to get water from places where there might be a bit more of it to places where there's a lot less. But beyond that, there's all sorts of things that governments can do. And on the one hand, you've got stopping climate change to prevent droughts, particularly in the Mediterranean region, from getting worse. On the other hand, adapting to the effects and the damage that it's already causing is important. The world's already 1.2 degrees C hotter than it was before we started burning fossil fuels. And that's also something where we need to adapt to the new world that we're living in.
Now, we've seen extremely dry conditions here in Europe throughout the past year and even longer. How are things looking as we move into spring and summer?
Yeah, so I spoke to a scientist from the Europe's Copernicus Satellite Climate Monitoring Center this morning who told me that one of the problems with winter droughts is that it increases the risk of severe spring and summer droughts, which, if you think back to the kind of images we saw last summer of wildfires raging through France and Spain and Portugal and Italy and countries like this, it could really be very severe. On top of that, you then have the problem that having a bad summer drought increases the strength of the winter drought the following year. And so this is all very connected. The less water we have in the places where it needs to be, the harder it is for these communities to adapt.